Hello, welcome to the e-learning session on management of hazardous chemical. After completion of this course, you will be able to understand what are all the hazardous effects of chemical and what are all the entry routes into our bodies. You will be able to identify what are all the requirements of globally harmonized system standard on HAZCOM. You will be able to know what are all the different methods of doing the chemical risk assessment and how we can mitigate this risk with an appropriate control approach. And also at the end of this course, we will discuss what are all the basic do's and don'ts you need to follow while you are safely handle a hazardous chemical in your workplace. To learn it better, let me run through the ILO Chemical Convention C-170 on chemical. ILO Chemical Convention C-170 states that workers have a need for and right to information about the chemicals they use at work, that it is essential to prevent or reduce the incidence of chemically induced illness and injuries at work by ensuring that all chemicals are evaluated to determine their hazards, providing employers with a mechanism to obtain from suppliers information about the chemicals used at work so that they can implement effective programs to protect workers from chemical hazards, providing workers with information about the chemicals at their workplaces and about appropriate preventive measures so that they can effectively participate in protective programs, establishing principles for such programs to ensure that chemicals are used safely. According to this convention, use of chemical at work means the production of chemicals or using this chemical into our production process or any kind of internal and external transportation of chemical, handling of chemical, storage of chemical, as well as disposal of chemical as a waste. And also if for any maintenance or repair activity when the chemical is generated or chemical is being used as part of the process, this is also termed as use of chemical at work. To know all these hazardous effects of this chemical into our body or into the environment or what are all the physical damage they can cause to our workplace, we need to classify them accordingly. An ILO recommendation R177 is actually classifying all these chemicals based on their characteristics. What I am going to show you next is the details of this recommendation R177, where it's detailing all these characteristics of hazardous chemical, mentioning all the effects it may cause to our health, what are all the effects it may cause to our bodies, what are all the effects it may cause to the environment, as well as how damage it can cause to our workplace based on their own characteristics. Recommendation R177 classify chemical based upon the characteristics including toxic properties. It may be acute or chronic health effects in all parts of the body. Chemical or physical characteristics including the flammability, explosive, oxidizing and dangerously reactive properties. It can be corrosive or irritant properties. There may be sensitizing effects or allergic reaction, carcinogenic effects, teratogenic effects, that is capable of causing birth defects and mutagenic effects, and also effects on the reproductive system. As you can see from this chart, there is so many ways a chemical can cause an effect to our body, to the workplace, and also to the environment. As you can see, the chemical hazard can be classified into three different categories: physical hazards of chemical, environmental hazard, and the health hazard. As you can see from this chart, there are four different ways chemicals can get entry into our body: ingestion, inhalation, absorption, and injection. Among those, inhalation is the main cause of chemical entry into our body. As we can see, there is different chemical entry routes into our bodies. The effects on the specific body parts is actually depends on the entry routes. For example, if ingestion occurs, it directly affects to the gastrointestinal tract. Entry route is the inhalation, then it affects our respiratory tract. There is one other entry route is absorption. Now absorption might occur through our skin or it may occur through our eyes, and finally injection of chemical may occur intentionally and unintentionally in the workplace. Now the entry route are heavily influenced by the state of the chemical as well. Now if the chemical is in liquid form with higher volatility, the possible entry route may be inhalation. If the chemical is in gaseous form, also the possible entry route may be inhalation as well. As you can see from this flow diagram, if we irresponsibly discharge chemical into the environment, ultimately it comes back to the human body. If untreated chemical discharged to the aquatic system, the fish and other aquatic animals is absorb those untreated chemicals, and finally it is consumed by human, and all these untreated chemicals has been come back to our body again. If this chemical is being discharged to a soil or untreated chemical is being irresponsibly soil dumped, then this soil get exposed to human through agriculture and all these activities. So we can get exposed this untreated chemical again. The next part of this session is the evaluation of chemical hazard, that is risk assessment. A risk can be simply quantified as the chemical hazard and its exposure, and what are all the ultimate effects to our bodies. The chemical hazard depends on the substance quantity and concentration. The exposure of this chemical depends on the duration of the task as well as the dosage amount and the periodicity. The hazardous property of chemical depends on the quantity of this specific type of substance as well as the concentration of the chemical. The exposure mostly depends on the duration of the particular task, what is the dosage amount of the chemical, and what are all the periodicities of these activities. In this session, we will see step-by-step process of effective management of chemical risk at workplace. In stage 1, we need to find the hazard classification and match it to a hazard group. In stage 2, we need to find out how much of the substance we are going to use. In stage 3, we need to find out how much of this substance is going to get into the air. And finally, based on all these informations, we need to identify the appropriate control approach. This is hazard group table. In stage 1, based on the information available in safety data sheet, we need to identify which group these chemicals falls into. For example, if you see the table, if this chemical is particularly has a property like eye irritancy class 2, it will fall under hazard group A. If this chemical has properties such as carcinogenicity class 1, it will fall under hazard group E. Similarly, we need to go through all the informations from safety data sheet for particular chemicals, and we need to match with this GHS classification, and accordingly we need to find out which hazard group it falls into. Now in stage 2, we need to find out the amount or quantity of chemical using in our workplace. Let's say for example the chemical we are using is in solid form. If this chemical is used in grams, then the quantity will be termed as small. If the quantity of this solid chemical usage is in kilogram, then it will termed as medium. If the usage of this chemical is in ton, then the quantity will be termed as large. Similarly, if the chemical is in liquid form, if it is used in milliliter, it will termed as small. If it is used in liter, the quantity will be termed as medium. If the liquid whatever we are using in our workplace is in cubic meter, it is a bulk volume, then the quantity will be termed as large. Now in stage 3, we need to identify how much of this chemical is actually going into air. Again, we will consider a solid form of chemical and the liquid form of chemical. If the particular chemical is in solid form, the dustiness playing the key role on the exposure. It may be low, medium and high. And how we will define that? If the chemical is in pellet form, then there is a very less chance of creating any dust. So in this case, dustiness will be low. If this chemical comes up with a crystalline or granular size, there is a chance of creation of dust, but it will settle down very quickly. So in this case, the exposure will be comparatively lower. So the dustiness in this case will be medium. Now if the chemical is in fine powder form, then there is a big possibilities that the dust cloud may form during the usage, and it will definitely not settle down very quickly. So in this case, the dustiness of this particular chemical will be very high. Now if the chemical is in liquid, the volatility is the key. How we will identify the volatility of this particular chemical is high, low or medium? It is actually written in the safety data sheet, but it has a direct relation with the operating temperature as well. Now for the liquid chemical, what are all the considerations to identify the exposure? It actually depends on few factors. The volatility of this particular chemical depends on the boiling point and the operating temperature. The boiling point of a particular chemical you can get from the safety data sheet. And you can see from this graph, there is a relation between this boiling point and operating temperature. In normal room temperature, if the boiling point is below 50 degree, then the volatility is high. If the boiling point is in between 50 to 150 degree, then the volatility is medium. If the boiling point is above 150 degree, in that case the volatility is low. Now this is for the room temperature. If the temperature get increased, now it may be changed. We need to work out with this graph in that case. Now I will show you how this chart is actually working. For example, if the operating temperature is 40 degrees centigrade and that particular chemical has boiling point near around 130 degree. So from chart you can see the volatility of this particular chemical in this operating condition will fall under medium category. So similarly, you need to get this boiling point data from the safety data sheet and consider the operating temperature. From these two parameters, we need to identify the volatility of this chemical falls under which category. Now in stage 4, we have the required information in stage 1, stage 2 and stage 3. In stage 4, we need to identify the appropriate control measures for this particular chemical. To do that, whatever the information is required, we have gathered in stage 1, stage 2 and stage 3. In stage 1, we use this hazard group table for particular chemical. Now we need to transform this information into the stage 4. From this table in stage 4, you see there is a list of group, the similar group that is being listed in the hazard group table. And it also comes up with few other information like the dustiness and the volatility. We have done few examples in the stage 1 and stage 2 and stage 3 with a particular chemical. Let's say for one particular chemical which fall under hazard group B and the dustiness of this solid chemical is 1. In this case, the control approach will be 1. Let's say for example a specific solid chemical which dustiness is small and it's fall under hazard group B. The control approach from this table you can see will be 1. And if this chemical is liquid and it's fall under hazard group B, and if the volatility is fall under medium category, the control approach will be 2. And what this 1 and 2 means, we will see that in the later part of this session. Now we will see what this control approach 1, 2, 3, 4 means. In control approach 1, it means the general exhaust ventilation or the administrative control, a good hygiene practice within the workplace. Control approach 2 means local exhaust ventilation. Control approach 3 means isolation of particular hazards or containment of particular hazards within the process. And control approach 4 means seeking the advice of an expert to substitute the hazardous chemical into a less hazardous chemical. In this section, we will discuss about the hazard communication standard. We will go through the requirements of globally harmonized system, chemical level requirements, what are all the section of a safety data sheet, and how to establish an effective hazard communication within the workplace. As we mentioned earlier in the chemical convention, that the information availability regarding the critical hazardous chemical in the workplace is very important. We need to see what are all the sources of this information. We can check all these informations from the chemical label which is being posted in the container. We can also refer back to safety data sheets where all these detailed information regarding the chemical is there. And also we need to continuously communicate with our manufacturer or distributor to find out what are all the hazardous properties of the chemical. Now let's go through it one by one. What is the requirement of a chemical label? In globally harmonized system, it is required that each chemical label must need to have at least 6 sections. This is an example of a chemical label. You see here it has 6 sections. The section 1 is the product identifier, the chemical name itself. And second, you can see 2 pictograms in either side of this label. This pictogram you can find out from the safety data sheet. And then in section 3 of this label, there is a signal word. In section 4, it is mentioned clearly what are all the hazard presents within the chemical. In section 5, it is defined all the precautionary statement regarding this chemical. And in the bottom of this chemical label, you can see all the informations regarding the manufacturer of this chemical. So for every chemical, it is a must requirement to come up with a proper chemical label, and it should have all these 6 sections as per the globally harmonized system. In the chemical label, you see there is 2 pictures that is called pictogram. In globally harmonized system, there is a specific pictogram that needs to be used for any particular chemical. As I said earlier, you can get this pictogram from the safety data sheet. Now these are all the pictograms that should come up with a proper safety data sheet, and it should be clearly in the chemical level as well. Now there are a few other chemical pictogram is there. Now these are all the pictograms that should come up with a proper safety data sheet, and it should be mentioned clearly in the chemical level as well. Now there are a few other chemical pictogram is there which is specific to transportation of chemical. As you can see from this chart, there are a few other pictograms specific to transportation of chemical. From this chart you can see these are almost similar to the pictograms whatever we have shown before, but there is slight difference into this. One important things in this case need to be considered. Where transport pictogram appears, the GHS pictogram for the same hazard should not appear. Another important tool to identify the hazardous property and critical information regarding a chemical is safety data sheet. We need to ensure while procuring this chemical from a supplier or manufacturer, so it should come up with a safety data sheet that satisfy all the requirements of globally harmonized system. It is a mandatory requirement that each chemical should have its own safety data sheet at the user end. Now as per globally harmonized standard, a safety data sheet should contain a 16 sections. We will go through briefly with each of these sections what are all the contents of the section. In section 1 of a safety data sheet, you will identify what is the chemical name and what are all the informations regarding the suppliers or the manufacturer. Also from this safety data sheet you may find out the case number of this particular chemical. In section 2 of a safety data sheet, you will be able to identify the hazardous property of the chemical. In section 2, it is very critical part of the safety data sheet. In section 2, you will be identify the hazardous property of the chemical. Hazard statement like H phrase will be mentioned here, as well as the GHS pictogram may be also listed down in section 2. In section 3, you will be able to identify the composition of the chemical and what are all the ingredients in there. If it is a mixture, this information will be also in there. In section 4, it is also very critical because here all the first aid measure is being listed down. In case of any unwanted contact with the chemical, what you need to do, what are all the first aid measure, these are all listing down in section 4. Similar to section 4, in section 5, it mentions all the fire safety measures for any unwanted release. For example, if the chemical is flammable in nature or combustible in nature, if any unwanted release happen in the workplace, what are all the fire safety measures we need to take, that is clearly mentioned in this section. In section 6, it is specifically mentions all the requirements in case of any accidental release. If hazardous chemical spilled occurred in workplace, what are all the measures you need to take, or what are all the emergency response procedure, it is clearly mentioned in this section. In section 7, all the informations regarding the storage of chemical, disposal of this chemical and safe handling of chemical is mentioned. While handling this chemical as a hazardous waste, what are all the procedures need to be followed, this is also clearly mentioned in this section. In section 8, it talks about the exposure control, especially personal protective equipment. Now it is very critical to choose appropriate personal protective equipment while using hazardous chemical. No need to invent any new things. You can easily refer back to this section of safety data sheet and identify what are exactly the PPE required for this particular chemical. In section 9 and 10 of the safety data sheet, it specifies about chemical and physical properties as well as stability and reactivity information. What is the boiling point of this chemical? What is the volatility information of this chemical? What is the physical state of this chemical? Is it a self-reactive chemical or not? Will it undergo any destructive reactions or not? This sort of information will be mentioned clearly here in these two sections. In section 11 and 12 particularly talks about the toxicity information, how toxic it is to a human body, how toxic it is to the environment. This all information is mentioned in these two sections. One of the important things need to be considered while managing chemical is while using in the production process. Now the required informations regarding the safe disposal of this chemical can be mentioned here in the section 13 of the safety data sheet. In section 14 of the safety data sheet, it talks about the transport informations. We saw that a different kind of pictogram needs to be used while transforming a chemical that needs to be complied, and those particular information maybe you can get from this section, as well as what type of vehicle you need, what type of emergency process or procedure needs to be followed while transporting this chemical. That needs to be clearly understood, and all this information you can get from this section of the safety data sheet. In section 15 and 16, it talks about the regulatory information and all other required informations regarding this chemical. Now, this is very important, that what are all the information in the safety data sheet it mentions we need to follow, as well as we need to consider all the local requirements where this chemical will be used. If in section 16, if there is a substitute of this chemical is coming up, then this information will be there, as well as all the revision date of the safety data sheet should be mentioned clearly in this section. If any other information that is required to manage this chemical safely, you can consider that this will be there in section 16 as well. So, these are all 16 sections that needs to be there in any safety data sheet to follow the requirements of globally harmonized system. It is a must requirement that each chemical should come up with the safety data sheet, and it should be available at user end in any workplace while using this chemical. Now, sometimes it is difficult to post whole safety data sheet in your workplace where it is using. In that case, you can make available the main copy in one of your site offices, and then afterwards you can prepare a simplified version of the safety data sheet and post where it is using. In simplified version, you can mention the name of this chemical, what are all the hazardous properties, as well as first aid and firefighting measures, and what to do in case of any spill occurs into the workplaces. So, these are all the must required information you need to give in a simplified version of a safety data sheet. As you can see, safety data sheet and the chemical label are the two most important source of information from where we can get the required information regarding any hazardous chemical. Now, it is also important to responsibly source this chemical from a recognized suppliers or manufacturers. If the supplier and manufacturers are not fully aware or fully understand about the globally harmonized system requirements, it is our responsibilities to educate them and to ensure that they will come up with any product which has a globally harmonized system required safety data sheet. In next sections, we will discuss about what are all the requirements of a chemical storage. It is important to know how we will store this chemical in our workplaces, how we will transport this chemical within our factories. To know this better, we need to start with the compatibility check. In our chemical storage, there might be a chemical with different properties. Can we store them all together? Let's find out from this chart. This is a chemical compatibility chart. From this chart, we will be able to identify which chemical is suitable to store with which one. Also, we will identify which one is dangerous to store with other chemicals. Now, from this chart, let's find out first how to use this one. You see there is some pictograms is being listed in the horizontal line, as well as the same pictogram is listed in the vertical line. So, what we need to do is to choose one pictograms in the horizontal line and match up with all these pictograms in the vertical line. So, if one of these common cell is in green, that means it is okay to store these two chemicals together. If this cell color is in red, we cannot store these chemicals together. If this cell which is common between these two pictograms is in yellow, we may store together, but with a proper precaution. Let us make this process easy by giving an example. In this horizontal line, you can see a pictogram of a flammable chemical. If we go through with this vertical line with all other pictograms that is being listed on the left side, it only shows green cell with other flammable chemicals. So, all other cells that is red with this chemical is not suitable to store with. It is also showed yellow when it comes to stored with irritant. So, that means you can store this together with a proper precaution. Let us find out with another example if we are not following this compatibility chart in our chemical storage. As you can see, this flammable chemical is not suitable to store with an oxidizer or with a toxic chemical. So, what will happen? If a flammable chemical is stored alone or stored with other flammable chemical, if there is any fire or explosion occurs, it will only create a huge fume. But if it is stored with a toxic chemical, and afterwards if there is any fire and explosion occurs, it will create a toxic fume, which is much more riskier and may cause a severe consequences. Now let us find out what are all the ideal facilities a chemical storage should have. Let us go through with these photos and find out each one of those. A means here architectural requirements. That means the chemical storage needs to be built up with adequate construction materials to satisfy the separation requirements with other occupancies. B means here firefighting and gas alarm. C is the use of explosion proof lighting. D denotes the requirements for chemical containers. E here is the leak proof secondary containers. F means explosion proof mechanical ventilation. In this picture, G mentioned as requirement for leak proofing ground. H here is equipped with STS on site. By I, it mentioned closed fireproof door which should be outward opening. J mentioned here as firefighting facilities, for example fire extinguisher. K is explosion proof switching. L here is a warning label, and M is emergency shower and eye wash devices. I want to take this opportunity to share an interesting idea. There is a direct link between the chemical label and safety data sheet. It is a common problem in our workplace that sometimes the chemical label is missing or maybe get damaged. By using safety data sheet, you can prepare your own chemical label. A globally harmonized system requirements regarding a chemical label is it has to be come up with 6 sections: product identifier, pictogram, signal words, hazard statement, precautionary statement, and manufacturer information. Now, if you look back all the section of safety data sheet, you can see all these 6 information is actually being mentioned clearly in the safety data sheet. So, if you are missing with the chemical label, or if a chemical label in a container is damaged, you can refer back to your safety data sheet, collect all those necessary information and prepare your own label. In this section, we will discuss about the safe handling methodology of hazardous chemical. While this chemical using in the production process, it is necessary to identify what are all the control approaches we have. We need to have adequate general exhaust and local exhaust ventilation if it is required as per the chemical risk assessment. Also, at the user end, the workers should be equipped with proper personal protective equipment. Like if a hazardous chemical which has higher volatility, a respiratory protection may be required, or if there is a chance of getting exposed to the skin or hands, a hand protection must need to be there. And also it is important to choose the appropriate tools while using this chemical or transporting this chemical internally within the workplace. As I mentioned earlier, a hazardous chemical waste, it poses the similar level of risk as a raw chemical. So we need to deal with this hazardous chemical appropriately. Few examples of this hazardous chemical waste can be spent chemicals or pesticides, maybe used batteries, contaminated clothes or personal protective equipment, and empty chemical containers. Now, a hazardous chemical waste can be but not limited to the spent chemical, pesticides, the used batteries, or maybe an empty chemical container, and sometimes the contaminated clothes or personal protective equipment. There are a few precautions we need to consider while handling this hazardous waste. Hazardous waste needs to be stored in a proper container. While handling this hazardous waste, a proper personal protective gear needs to be worn. This waste needs to be stored in a properly well ventilated area and also with a secondary containment. Finally, there are a set of personal hygiene rules that need to be maintained to prevent from any kind of contamination from hazardous chemical. A set of good personal hygiene needs to be maintained to prevent any kind of contamination from hazardous substances. No food and drink within the workplace. Wash your hands before eating and drinking. Wash your hands before and after going to the bathroom. Do not wear contaminated clothes outside the workplace. Change clothes at the end of your shift. Do not take them back to home. Keep the workplace clean. And finally, lactating mothers should change their clothes or wash properly before visiting babies. Before closing this session, I want to share a few checkpoints which you can consider to check out the performance of your chemical management system. One key checkpoints could be Do you have a proper chemical inventory with adequate information or not? Now, it is very important to know what are all the chemicals that is being used in our production process and what are all the different hazards we have in our workplace. Now, the second checkpoint is the formal training plan regarding the chemical management. It is paramount important that everyone in the workplace, especially the user of chemical, has proper level of knowledge on the hazardous chemical management. The third critical point is what are all the information sources available to find out whatever the chemical you are using, how much hazardous it is. For example, do you have a proper globally harmonized system safety data sheet available or not? Do you posted all this simplified version of the safety data sheet in different places of your workplace? Do you have all the proper chemical label posted correctly in your chemical container? Do you sourcing all these chemicals from a responsible manufacturer or supplier? It is also important that you have a mechanism of communicating all these critical informations to your workforces. The fourth point is probably the most critical one. Now we have all these information sources and we know all the hazardous property of the chemical. We need to find out the effectiveness of our risk assessment. We need to do an analyze in our workplace. Do we have the proper control approaches or not? Do you have the general exhaust ventilation where it is required? Do you have the isolation and containment when it is required or not? Do you have a formal chemical risk assessment process? So these are all critical points to maintain the sound chemical management in the organization. The next point is the hazardous waste management. Now we have taken care of all this chemical management in our storage and in the production process. So hazardous chemical can be come up with in the liquid form and as well as in the solid form with the sludge from the ETP. We need to find out the proper methods of dealing with all these hazardous waste. Based on the hazard category, do we have a proper treatment plant or not? Do we have a proper disposal plan or not? Do you have an adequate contractor or vendors to deal with our waste or not? Finally, we need to consider all the legal requirements regarding chemical management. While you are using this chemical, you need to refer back to your risk register as well as legal register. What are all the requirements exist where this workplace situated, and 100% time we need to follow all these legal requirements. Thanks for participating the training with us. It's time for you to attend the post-test exam. See you in the next session with a different topic. Until then, it's goodbye.